Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this exciting session we have. My name is Lyle Wind. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here at Stony Brook University, and we're looking forward to hearing about this session, but we're also interested in any questions that you guys may have as well. So if any point during today's session you have any questions you'd like to submit, please direct them to the Q&A tab, and we will get to them at the conclusion of today's session. But at this point, we're going to turn it over to Professor Toms, and she's going to let us all know what she's got to say.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I see people are starting to come in. So let me just start by welcoming you to this seminar and how excited I am that you're interested in Stony Brook and here to find out more about the faculty who teach here. I've been at Stony Brook since 1978, so I am a real old timer. But very, very happy with the place that I teach. And I hope today I can share some of my research with you as an example of the kind of work that we do at Stony Brook, that if you come here as a student, you're going to be involved in. We are very much a teaching-centered research university, so you'll be part of the next round. So as my starting slide here indicates, I'm going to be talking today about pandemic preparedness. I have to admit, when I gave this title to the admissions team, I thought no one is going to want to sign up for this because we're all really tired of COVID, thinking about COVID. I'm really tired about COVID. On the other hand, this is such a dramatic event in our lifetime that we're forced to think about it and to contend with it. It is going to shape your life in a way that people like my daughter, who was 9 on the day that the Twin Towers came down, shaped her life. You're living through this pandemic is going to mark you as a generation for the rest of your lives. So we have to think about it. We have to use all the tools we can to try to understand what happened and hopefully do better. Now, you may think to yourself, what does a professor of history have to say about this? And I hope to show you that, in fact, history, as well as other humanities and social sciences, are very relevant in understanding science, technology, engineering, medicine, and math, which is often the areas that students come to Stony Brook interested in, but not all that Stony Brook has to offer you. So what I'm going to talk about today is to explore some of COVID's potential as both a tragic but useful teaching opportunity. I'm going to share some information about how a historical look back, I'll explain what that is, at the World War I influenza pandemic shaped responses to COVID-19. And I'm going to reflect on some of the challenges of teaching about these failures and others when we try to learn from the past. I'm going to start with a question. And I'm not going to ask you to answer it out loud, but I'll give you a minute to read this quote and then say to yourself, what president said this? A pandemic is a lot like a forest fire. If caught early, it might be extinguished with limited damage. If allowed to smolder undetected, it can grow to an inferno that spreads quickly beyond our ability to control it. Now, I'll tell you, in previous talks, when I've asked this question, including to high school teachers, they've said Franklin Roosevelt, they've said Theodore Roosevelt, and they said Barack Obama. Guess what? All wrong. It's George W. Bush, who I will point out was a history major at Yale University. Why did George W. Bush, the president number 43, I believe, why did he get concerned about the possibility of a pandemic? In fact, he read a book of history, a book by John Barry, still well up on the bestseller list through COVID, called The Great Influenza. It was first published in 2004. And the story goes that President Bush took it to his vacation home to read in the summer. And he was so upset with what he read that it convinced him, again, as he stated in 2005, if we wait for a pandemic to appear, it will be too late to prepare. So in fact, the United States, as well as the WHO and other countries, had quite elaborate pandemic planning processes that they went through to try to prepare in particular for a pandemic influenza. These were developed during President Bush's administration, and then they were carried over into President Obama's. So what prompted all of this worry in the early 21st century? One were growing concerns expressed by public health experts about the threat of so-called emergent and re-emergent diseases, new diseases, novel diseases that were called out by scientific reports and also by Laurie Garrett's book, The Coming Plague in 1994. After 9/11, there were concerns about bioterrorism. Actually, they predate 9/11. Concerns that Russia and Iraq were developing germ bioweapons programs. And then after September 11th, anthrax attacks made the fear of bioterrorism grow. There were also growing concerns about the ability to manipulate genes, that you could engineer new novel threats. And then finally, there were concerns about food safety that played into this. Mad cow disease, E. coli tainted beef. So all of these kind of growing worries in the 1990s kind of peak in the early 2000s. Now, you might think at this point, well, this calls for forward-looking action, more scientific study, more preparation, more technology, more engineering. Well, it did, but it was this preparedness project also involved a historical component. In planning circles, the idea of a so-called look back, that's their language, is a way of looking at past experience to try to get ideas about how to respond to the present. And in the case of pandemic preparedness, this look back focused on the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, which is still the deadliest outbreak of the 20th century. And it was federal funding, including from the Department of Defense and the Centers for Disease Control, that enabled scholars like Howard Markel, he's an MD, PhD, and other historians, including me, to do extensive analysis of the flu's impact in the United States. And if you'd like to take a look at some of what this historical project turned up, the University of Michigan's Center for the History of Medicine has a wonderful influenza archives and encyclopedia, and there's the URL for that. So why did they pick, when they asked historians like me to do this look back, why did they pick the World War I flu? Well, first off, in biological terms, this particular strain of the H1N1 influenza is still impressive in the damage that it did. And just compare the tolls. World War I combat death was 8.5 million. The influenza death toll during these same years was at least 50 million. It's probably bigger than that because of the difficulty collecting statistics, particularly in India. And compare that with the most recent pandemic to preoccupy most of us, the AIDS death toll, as of 2018, 32 million. So you can see any disease that killed conservatively 50 million people within a 2-year time period was considered worth a look back. But there were other reasons. The flu pandemic, as I'm going to explain to you, turned out to be a great, what we call natural experiment. It's not something scientists set up, it's something that just happened. But the way the flu unfolded allowed historians to go back and ask some interesting questions. So let me try to explain very quickly why this was. The main wave of flu occurred in fall 1918. There were earlier smaller outbreaks, but the big one started in September, October. The outbreaks, initial outbreaks were in various parts of the world. It's not clear which was first. It was misleadingly called the Spanish flu, not because it started in Spain, but because Spain was not a combatant in World War I, and thus its newspapers carried stories about the flu without concern about censoring that this might be affecting troop movements and military issues. I am not going to call it the Spanish flu, although I will slip because that's a common nickname. I'm going to stick to what John Barry calls it, which is the Great Influenza. It spread first in the fall among troops involved in World War I, and then it jumped to civilian populations as those troops began to demobilize. This was the end of World War I. This particular strain of the flu was highly contagious, and it was more deadly than the normal flu, seasonal flu, that was already a commonplace in this time period. What made the great influenza so deadly is that it killed young people in the prime of life. And the death tolls took on what public health experts call the W shape, which you never want to see. So basically, here's a chart showing you the difference between the normal or seasonal influenza, 1911 to 1917, that's the dotted line. And you can see the most likely deaths were among either the very young, very fragile infants or very old people. Look at the 1918, 1919, and it's the same peak. You see that big bump of death rates, the W, the number of young people that were dying. And it was indeed not only the numbers, but this its ability to hit the young and the vigorous that was so terrifying about this influenza. Now, in 1918, what did they know about influenza? In fact, they knew a fair amount. The so-called germ theory of disease was no longer a theory. Bacteriology, as it was called then, was well established. But here's a technological interesting side note. With the microscopes that they had available in this time period, you could only see bacteria and other large microorganisms. Viruses were too small. In fact, no one can see a virus until the electron microscope is invented in the 1930s. Yet, despite the fact they couldn't see these smaller particles, through very clever experimental methods, these bacteriologists had figured out that there was something smaller than a bacteria that was capable of causing diseases, and they called these viruses, or sometimes filterable viruses. With influenza, there was a heated debate in this time. Was it a bacteria? Was it a virus? And they never really resolved that argument. What was germ X calling the great influenza? And in fact, it's not until the 1990s that the specific strain of the H1N1 was isolated through frozen samples. Great story, don't have time to tell you, but it's that intersection again between history and kind of modern technologies that really, archaeovirology, that's really interesting. But even though they didn't have that fancy kind of perspective in 1918, they knew that this particular communicable disease was very, very deadly. It was clear how deadly it was when it first hit cities in the United States in September and October. So it was Boston and Philadelphia that got hit hard first. Again, this is related by travel patterns. That's where the demobilized troops were coming back as the war was winding down. And here's, in fact, I've seen this photograph a lot in the last year of one of the makeshift hospitals set up for all the soldiers and then civilians coming down. These cities being hit hard was also in the news. It wasn't the kind of social media we now have to let us know what's going on, but rather newspapers. That's what people used to get their news back in that day. Many cities had multiple newspapers. They had them in the morning, they had them in the afternoon, and tracking the influenza was a big deal. So you got a lot of headlines like this from Brookline, Massachusetts, talking about the spread of the maladies. Schools and churches are closing, meetings suspended, and really letting people know this was an event out of the ordinary and really quite terrifying. So what makes this a good look back for planning purposes in the early 21st century is the way the flu moved from city to city and by trains. There are no airplanes yet, so this is all really trains that allow it to move across the country. You could see how this new disease threat spread along modern transportation, and how different cities responded to it had an influence on what their mortality rates were. Now, at this point in time, this is a big difference between now and then. There were not yet vaccines for diseases like influenza. There was smallpox vaccination, and there was something they could give you to try to save you if you had diphtheria. But this is before the modern age of vaccines or antibiotics or antiviral drugs. In public health, the way you managed a pandemic like this was trying to contain it by trying to limit how fast it spread. And they had ways that they tried to slow it down. So the historical question was, what did cities do to try to slow the spread, and which of these methods were effective? So in other words, you could go, we had good enough statistics that you could look at the death rate in New York versus St. Louis versus San Francisco. You could pair that with, well, what did New York do? What social distancing methods did it adopt? And try in a very crude way, again, this is not it's crude, but it's still useful to see what methods seem to work to lower the mortality rates. Or the expression flattening the curve, in fact, was part of the discussion about World War One. What did cities do that helped limit the death rate from the Great Influenza? And I show here a classic article. It appeared in 2007 in JAMA. Non-pharmaceutical interventions is basically anything that wasn't a drug that used to combat the influenza. That's today what we call social distancing methods. So anything that wasn't having a drug or a vaccine. This is an article by Howard Markel and his colleagues that did this initial look back at social distancing methods, and then whether it affected mortality rates. Now, what they found when they went and did this study is that the more swiftly a city enacted a suite or a set of social distancing measures, the lower their mortality rates. Now, you might ask, what did they do? What did they mean by social distancing in this time period? These, in fact, were practices that had been developed with other kinds of very catching diseases like smallpox and cholera. It kind of experience that showed if you had a fast spreading disease, the first thing you wanted to do was to identify people who were sick and isolate them, get them into a hospital where they wouldn't then spread on the chain of infection. So that's number one. Detect, isolate, care for. Second, you wanted to limit face-to-face contact among everyone else to try to slow down the spread. People with influenza could be contagious before they knew they were really sick. They could be walking around, in a subway or in a movie theater and spread the flu that way. You had to make people more careful about how close they got to each other and how they interacted. There were all kinds of different ways to try to limit face-to-face contact. This could include school closures, which some cities did, business closings, which others did, limits on public gatherings. No more than 50 people can meet in such and such a place. Again, sound familiar? It's basically the same playbook that we have used with COVID. And then last but not least, careful personal hygiene. Everyone was supposed to be careful about how they coughed, sneezed, and spit, and how they washed their hands. By this point, in the understanding of how respiratory infections spread, there was an understanding that coughing and spitting and sneezing could spread droplets or aerosol particles that would hang in the air and could make someone else sick. And thus you needed to try to cover your face if you did any of these things. And we'll see in a minute, a lot of what they did was really use handkerchiefs. I know that sounds stupid, but, and then in some places, especially in the West Coast, they did start to use masks. Also hand washing. They had an understanding even then that the hand, they didn't quite understand it's the hand to the eye or the hand to the mouth, but they knew hands were a problem. So you were supposed to wash your hands a lot. Now, this explains how I got recruited into the Markel team, because my area of historical specialization turned out to be how ordinary people came to believe in the existence of germs, starting in the late 1800s, and what they knew about germs at the time of the pandemic. And in fact, the kinds of habits that Americans had been taught to practice to try to protect themselves against germs, microbes, as they were called. So I wrote a book called The Gospel of Germs, Men, Women, and the Microbe in American Life. And in that book, I looked at all the different ways people altered their living habits from the 1880s through World War I to try to avoid coming into contact with deadly germs. And the World War I prevention crusades against influenza built on this gospel of germs. In fact, and here's there was a conference of historians to look at different aspects of the pandemic, and this was my piece for it, published in 2010. I cannot tell you how many phone calls I got from journalists because this article got out in the journalist sphere early on in the pandemic, because inadvertently, a lot of what I described in this paper about what the problems were in implementing social distancing turned out to be eerily forecasting what happened with COVID. And essentially, I was just trying to look at why being in a more modern mass society makes it difficult to do things like close schools and stay at home. I also looked at the kind of messaging that was used, and here you can see how influenza was being tagged on with tuberculosis. That was really the leading cause of death in the early 20th century. And things like keeping your bedroom windows open. I mean, you don't know how many times it's not laughing, but when I hear how important it is to open the windows, boy, that is straight out of the same public health gospel that my great grandmother would have heard. And in fact, fresh air does dilute the floating around of these particles. So they were onto that even in this time period. I also got really interested in the use of images to try to convince people to change their behavior at public health. This was kind of the beginning of a more image conscious public health messaging. And these are just some of they're really crude, but by World War I standards, these were avant-garde, and you can see here not so much emphasis on the mask, but instead on using a handkerchief. And I'll just share with you one finding out of this work that I still don't entirely understand, and that I mention anytime I present on this material. In all the public health images I looked at from World War I never found one with a woman. The targets of these ads were men sneezing and trying to be more careful with their sneezes. And if you're interested, I can give you boy, did I get journalist questions about that too. I can talk to you about some of the possible explanations for that. Here's another one with the handkerchief. And here you can see, again, this image has been shown so many times in the last year of mask wearing. Mask wearing was not a central part of social distancing throughout the United States. It really was a West Coast phenomena. Again, we can talk about why that was, but the idea that you needed really to wear a mask to protect yourself was certainly introduced, but it was not an idea promoted throughout the country. So to go back to the Markel findings, indeed, they found that cities that were more willing to experiment with social distancing lowered their mortality rates. In my work, I tried to look at what the resistance was. I mean, if this was true, what were the explanations for why people didn't want to do this? And again, the reasons I found sound very familiar to us today. That businesses did not want to close. Workers couldn't afford to stay home because they wouldn't get paid. Parents had no one to watch their kids if the schools closed down. I also found definitely the public safety versus economy issue that we've heard so much about. That was definitely voiced in this time period. And also one that I thought was particularly interesting was that confinement, like not letting people go to the movies or the theater, could be bad for their mental health, and that might be bad, might make them more susceptible to the influenza. This was an argument used by the Commissioner of Health in New York City, who did not want to close Broadway, did not want to close down movie theaters, and got a lot of pressure from the entertainment industry. And instead, what he proposed was staggering hours. And also, if you showed a movie, you had to show a public health film about sneezing carefully and keeping your windows open. So the main point of my article really was I looked at the kind of explanations that and really tortured discussions that public health experts had, that even though we now go back and look and say, dang, you did a pretty good job with what you had available, they felt terrible. They felt really defeated by the influenza and that they should have done better. And certainly one of the lessons they took away was exactly, you could have a certain scientific knowledge, but getting public compliance with that could be very difficult. And here's a quote from a popular magazine from 1919. Influenza spread was simple to understand, but difficult to control. So my thinking about pandemic planning and the value of historical lookbacks, it's led me to a lot of my own soul searching, I'd say, over the last year. When I first began to give this talk was last March. There's a recording of me that C-SPAN came to make, and that is now in their archives, where I present some of this early material, and I'm very optimistic because I really believed that this wisdom about, well, if you're willing to social distance, we can buy that time to get the vaccine, that this, really was going to make a lot of sense to people, and thus we could minimize the damage. A year later, that optimism was unwarranted. And I think we've seen all kinds of complications that come for non-scientific reasons. And again, this is why I think a research university like Stony Brook is important, because we don't look just at the scientific, the technological side, but we're also looking at the context and how it plays out. So you have political science, you have anthropology, you have history. We have to take a big picture to understand events like this. My guess is, based on previous pandemics, that the psychological, economic dislocations from this are likely to be profound. Some of them we already can see. Others we have yet to see. One big concern you probably have heard about are the mental health consequences of this past year. And it certainly made us very aware of problems in the way we have organized our lives up to this point. Problems in pandemic preparedness, problems in a new global supply chain where all it takes is one cargo liner to get stuck in the Suez Canal and you're in trouble. I mean, these kind of problems with our modern assumptions about how to stay safe, it's been a very sobering event. I still think that we can learn from the past to do better in the future. And my hope is that if you come to Stony Brook as a student, that you will be part of that generation that is going to help figure out better ways and maybe help us get something good out of the global trauma that the last year has brought. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions from you. I'll be glad to take them. I believe Lyle is going to be my helper here and see if we've got any in the
Sure.
chat.
Yeah, right now we don't. So we definitely want
Okay.
anybody who's got any questions to ask. But I was listening to your presentation, and I was very amazed as to how many of the things that they did so many years ago, like social distancing, flattening the curve, limits on gatherings,
Yeah.
open windows, was their playbook. And I'm wondering because I heard today on the news that they say within a couple months, we could really be out of this with
Mhm.
the herd immunity and such. I wonder if you had any thoughts as to if it weren't for all the stuff that we learned from 90 years ago, you have an estimate as to how much longer you think it would have taken us for us to get so out of this?
It's a good question, and unfortunately, the I think the response to the pandemic got politicized this time around in ways it didn't in World War One. So often when I talk about it, the idea that you would not wear a mask was considered unpatriotic. They called them mask slackers. And to
Mm.
be a slacker when the nation was at war was a terrible thing. So there was a more consistent message in World War One that maybe made it easier for people to accept the need to change their behavior. Also, people in that time period were much more frightened of infectious diseases. You've probably heard, maybe even some of your family members say, this COVID, we have overreacted to it. It's just the flu. And in fact, the seasonal flu is like that I showed you. It can kill people, but since we have antibacterials, it's less likely. Most of the deaths from influenza are from bacterial side infections. But the problem is that this is not just the usual. It is not like the flu, and it's not like the cold. It really is a natural force to be reckoned with. And being frightened of it, to me, is a very prudent. Uh, I have been a really, very careful in observing what I was asked to do, and I have to admit that I've been kind of surprised at the degree to which this was kind of made to seem like a really ridiculous response to something killing so many people. You may also have seen in the news for last year, COVID is the third highest cause of death. So I assume cancer, heart disease are one and two, and then COVID. That is unheard of since the 1920s. That was the point at which heart disease and cancer started to become the number one and number two, and diseases like catching diseases fell. Um, so it's been a rough year, I think, for scholars and also public health. My friends in public health, it's been a rough year for them to kind of see things that they think are so reasonable be trashed to such a degree. Uh, so part of the argument is if we had been more willing to social distance, uh, might fewer people have died. So we're going to be arguing about that for a long time.
Um, so we do have some questions that have come in, which is great. Somebody asked a question. Do you know if there were any herbs used as preventative historically? So back in the Great Influenza, what were there herbs being used at that point?
You know, homemade medicine was still really important in this time period. So certainly the kinds of things that households would use. It could be an herbal concoction. In big cities by this time period, um, over-the-counter drugs had really become very common. So if you were talking about out in the countryside, you might be getting like your grandmother's tea recipe, but more likely, if you're in New York City, you might be getting what we would call a patent medicine remedy. And there were efforts to try to say, take this cure-all and it'll protect you against the flu. Didn't work very well. But yes, they did try to self-medicate. But this was I didn't go into the gory details, but this was a flu that could kill people within 24 hours, turn them blue, blood coming from orifices. It was really scary. So you it didn't seem like something that an herbal remedy was necessarily going to be very useful for. More useful was to try to get away from it. This is one of the oldest methods is there's an epidemic coming, run away. So again, when I would hear about people moving to, the Catskills or whatever, I thought, yep, that's an age-old way is just try to get away from it. Okay, another question?
Yeah, we've got one from Emmanuel, and he wants to know how do you know when it really ends? Because uh, with the great influenza pandemic, if viral strains never go away, how do you know? And even with the current pandemic, how
Yes.
do we know when it's safe to say it's over?
That is an excellent question, Emmanuel. And basically our understanding of when it was over with the pandemic influenza was when the death rates came down. There was good enough public health accounting, especially in big cities, that public health departments were week by week saying this many people died. And so they felt it was over when the death rates really, were approaching zero. Did they fear that another variant was going to come around? That's a really good question to ask. At this point in time, they didn't understand viruses as kind of packets of DNA and RNA the way we do. We now have a much more sophisticated understanding of how viruses mutate. And again, they didn't have that. They didn't have, Crick and Watson, the DNA. They didn't have the double helix. They knew none of that at this time. So they were less, they didn't talk so much about it coming back right away. It was kind of like, let's just get through this. And then they hoped that then when flu season started to come around the next year, that it was going to be back to the U shape instead of the W shape. My concern as a citizen today, and to go back to Lyle's question about remaining vigilant, is I think, Emmanuel, the question you're raising about variants, now that we know that, and now that also the speed of traveling is so much greater, that is something we need to be much more careful about. So whatever herd immunity is going to look like, my guess is we are still going to be asked to be careful for quite some time. I don't know. We're going to be back on campus in person in the fall, please God. But my guess is a lot of the ways, a lot of the signs around campus, and maybe some of the kind of social distancing may still be in place. we will await. Stony Brook was terrific about taking guidance from our local experts. They did a tremendous job, and I think we have an excellent track record in how we've managed COVID, and we're proud of that. So we'll be trying to do our best for you in the fall as well.
Somebody else asks, at what point did you begin this research?
A good question. My interest in germs really came about from living through the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So that book was published in 1998. I probably started working on it in the late 1980s, at the point when HIV/AIDS was killing. It was horrible. It was a really a very painful period. And it seemed impossible to cure it at that point. Fortunately, we did eventually get antiviral treatments that have now made HIV and AIDS chronic diseases, and not, if you've got it, you're immediately gonna die. But it was the AIDS epidemic and the kinds of things that people believed spread AIDS, that were just totally incorrect. That the public health experts were saying, no, you don't catch it from a doorknob, not from a toilet seat. And I'm like, where do people get these ideas about doorknobs and toilet seats? Well, I found out. I went back and I looked at the way my grandmother and my mother were taught to think germs spread, and that I had in my own head. That's where it came from. And like Lau said, a lot of this stuff about washing your hands, keeping your windows open, really dates to the late 1800s. And it was a direct response to scientific discoveries. You've probably heard of Pasteur, Robert Koch, the kind of bench scientist who proved that it was in fact these specific germs that were causing these specific diseases. I never thought that knowing so much about the old germ theory would come in so useful in 2020 or 2021. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's really amazing considering they didn't have a playbook to work off of like we did.
Yeah,
They didn't have the vaccine, so the fact that they were able to eradicate that so quickly is extremely impressive. That they
yeah.
did it so well.
And it's a reminder that paying attention to public health, the prevention, I think that's again, you can't rely entirely on high tech biomedicine to solve your health crises. It really, you got to tend to things like housing and diet and you know uh, conditions that allow people's immune systems to work properly.
Monica has a question, and I guess she wants to know, like in the pictures that were shown,
Mhm.
why was it only the men wearing?
Yes, exactly. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, Monica. And one explanation that someone suggested to me, I would never have thought of. But it was the idea that showing a woman sneezing was against Victorian etiquette. That this, even though the kind of totally covering yourself up and the kind of very prudish attitudes of the 19th century were starting to lift, there was still this sense that you didn't talk about these kind of common functions for ladies. So there was something indelicate about showing the woman. The other explanation that I think is also plays in here is that whole Gospel of Germs that I studied and how it developed was very much identified with by this time period with your mother and your school teacher, and telling you, Johnny, you have to wipe your nose, to be a gentleman or whatever. And so some of this was a little pushback against the, the overbearing, in later times they'd call it the nanny state, people trying to tell you wear a seatbelt or a face mask, that this is emasculating you. And I think there was a little bit of that going on. Real men, I mean, I have to imagine Theodore Roosevelt died before the pandemic, but would Theodore Roosevelt have worn a mask? I don't know. He was such a, strong, I don't need to do this. That I think it was also about masculinity, that this was just too fussy. Um, and so there was a image problem there in terms of the sneezing. But thank you for asking that question.
Well, I think even today, they say that certain males and men are
Yes.
less interested and less likely to want to get the vaccine as well. So
Also, Lyle, there have been lots of studies of people's actual behavior that will document. There's one really horrific one where somebody went into the bathroom, I think it was the American Public Health Association, and looked at people going to the bathroom and not washing their hands afterwards. And here's a public health, meeting, and the large numbers of men not washing their hands after they went to the bathroom. So there is some kind of gendered piece to this, and that it, yeah, I think you're right. Uh,
we got a question here from Aaron, and Aaron wants to know, what do you think the United States has to do to prepare for a future pandemic?
Very, very good question. Um, so I've spent a lot of time reading the old pandemic planning documents. They're fascinating. And Erin, you would be really impressed at the time and effort that went into this. They really thought very hard. And some of what they suggested was stockpiling of vital medical equipment. Um, and I would say in the future that that's got to be more of an emphasis. My guess is that that kind of got put in the playbook, but um, there was an assumption that if a new disease was threatening, that you could get manufacturing done fast enough that you didn't really need to stockpile. So it is a little bit of, I don't know if you've been reading the stuff about the kind of global supply chain and what we've learned about it in the pandemic, that our global economy has gone more to just in time manufacturing. So you put in the order with the expectation you're going to get it really fast, kind of like I put in, my Amazon, whatever. I expect to get it, the next day. I think they had the expectation, well, when we need PPE, we'll just put in the order and it'll be there. Well, once the pandemic really got going, obviously, that wasn't happening. So my guess is there's going to be a lot of rethinking about the concept of stockpiling and of preparedness, and not being quite so dependent on factories in other parts of the world. I think another big issue that's going to come out of this is going to be the vaccine fairness problems. You may have read in the paper that I think 3/4 of all once the vaccines became available, they have been bid for and locked down by the wealthiest countries. And it means that other countries may not get COVID vaccines for years. Now, what does that mean? This is to go back to the question, I think, can't remember who it was who asked about the variants. It's like we could reach herd immunity to whatever variants we've been exposed to, but if the vaccine isn't being widely used in other parts of the world, other variants could get going that come back and affect us. So my guess in terms of preparedness is there's going to be some real hard thinking about equity issues around vaccine distribution.
And Anna asks a very interesting question. She says, do you think the reason that there are many Americans who doubt the science is because people we look towards, like Dr. Fauci and many others, kind of changed the guidelines? Initially, it was like masks aren't going to protect you, then masks will, and then you should be wearing two or three masks. Do you think this has anything to do with why some people aren't looking to buy in as much?
I think Dr. Fauci's behavior by itself really, I would, public health folks are more likely to target President Trump and to say his lack of consistency in his message was much more of a problem than Fauci changing his mind. But I have had this discussion with public health experts, and in fact, I'm really excited. I may get a chance to work with the World Health Organization to talk to them about their messaging. Is that we need to make clear that it takes time to figure out a new disease, and that what you get, scientists are going to change their mind, and they should. Dr. Fauci's initial comments were based on what he knew at the time. He changed his mind when he got better data. That is what good science does, is it changes. But then to go back and say, but he got it wrong, so that means mask wearing is wrong, when study after study has come through and said, nope, it really doesn't make a difference. Double masking, I mean, I do it. I'm not sure in the end if it's really, it may turn out one was good enough. But I think we need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how good science works. And this is something at Stony Brook, I think we understand as a science school, is that you're going to change your point of view. But the real issue, I think, is to back up the change with some evidence. What's your evidence? What's good evidence? What's bad evidence? So that's kind of what I, as a citizen, I want to see some evidence for whatever I'm being told at the moment. And I think it's a really good idea when experts change their mind, that they are very clear about why they did it. And Dr. Fauci may have been wrong in not being clearer about that, but he certainly got clearer about it as he went along.
And it looks like what might be our final question is from Anisha,
Mhm.
and she's referring to how you had said that the great influenza was feared more
Mhm.
back then. What do you think can be done to help individuals see how scary COVID could be?
Oh, Anisha, that is a really something I almost lay awake at night thinking about, because to me, if seeing what was on the news about what was happening in hospitals wouldn't scare you, I don't know what would. So I'm really still puzzling over that myself. I think the average American, at least people with who are protected, who have decent incomes and nice houses, have really decided they don't need to be scared of communicable diseases, that they can always get a pill or a shot that will take it away. I think other people who've not had those kind of privileged lifestyles have been more frightened of catching diseases for a long time. And that's certainly true in other parts of the world. So I don't know. I'm still, that's part of what I'm struggling with, is if this didn't convince you that we need to be more mindful about novel viruses, then I don't know what, is it really going to take a zombie virus? Uh, I don't know. So I don't have a great answer, but it's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer to it.
Well, I found this extremely fascinating. I'm sure anybody who's contemplating majoring in history would
Yes,
definitely want to take
yes. Double major, yes. Also, if you want to do bio, you can double major. Yeah. And compliments, great questions. Really, really high quality, what I would expect from a Stony Brook student. So again, thanks for coming, and thanks for your interest in Stony Brook. And I know if you have other questions, either about the topic or about anything Stony Brook related, you have a great staff here to answer them.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for
My
joining.
pleasure. My pleasure. And good luck and stay well, everybody.
Okay. Everybody take care. Thanks again.
Okay. Bye-bye.